The dust swirled around Thomas McKenna's boots as he stepped off the stagecoach in Bitter Creek, Arizona Territory, clutching a crumpled deed in his weathered hand. The year was 1887, and the scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the desolate, frontier town. Thomas had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston, after receiving word that he'd won a ranch in a poker game for just $1. What seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime was about to reveal secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about the American West. The town of Bitter Creek sat like a forgotten memory in the shadow of the Sierra Mountains, where copper mines had once promised fortune but delivered only broken dreams. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling from years of relentless desert winds. The saloon doors swung lazily in the afternoon breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 3 times, marking another day in this godforsaken corner of the territory. Thomas approached the land office, his eastern clothes marking him as an outsider among the weathered cowboys and miners who populated the town. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the deed with skeptical eyes before nodding toward the mountains. The Widow's Peak Ranch lay 15 miles north, he explained, warning Thomas that the previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances 3 months prior. The journey to the ranch took Thomas through terrain unlike anything he'd encountered in Massachusetts. Sagebrush stretched endlessly toward jagged peaks, and the only sounds were the clip-clop of his hired horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas finally saw his property. The ranch house stood against the backdrop of towering cliffs, a modest structure built from local stone and timber. Smoke rose from the chimney, which struck Thomas as odd since he'd been told the place was abandoned. As he approached, a young woman emerged from the house, her long auburn hair catching the last light of day. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh land. Sarah Coleman had been living at the Widow's Peak Ranch for the past year, caring for the previous owner, old Pete Morrison, until his death. She possessed an otherworldly beauty that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape, with emerald eyes that held secrets and a voice that carried the musical cadence of Irish heritage. When Thomas introduced himself as the new owner, Sarah's expression grew troubled, and she spoke words that would haunt him for weeks to come. The inheritance included more than just the land, she warned. Old Pete had discovered something in the hills behind the ranch, something that had brought both fortune and curse to Widow's Peak. She'd stayed to protect what Pete had found, waiting for someone worthy to claim not just the property, but the responsibility that came with it. Thomas dismissed her words as frontier superstition, but as darkness fell over the ranch, he began to sense that Sarah knew things about his new home that he couldn't yet comprehend. That first night, Thomas lay in Pete's old bed listening to sounds he couldn't identify. Wind howled through the canyons with an almost human voice, and somewhere in the darkness he heard the distant sound of pickaxes striking stone. Sarah had retired to a small cabin behind the main house, but Thomas noticed lamplight flickering in her window well past midnight, as if she were keeping vigil against something unseen. Morning brought clarity to the landscape, but deeper mystery to Thomas's situation. Sarah prepared breakfast with ingredients that seemed far too fine for a remote ranch, including coffee that tasted better than anything he'd enjoyed in Boston's finest establishments. When he questioned her about Pete's discovery, she led him to a locked shed behind the barn, producing a key from a chain around her neck. Inside the shed, Thomas found equipment he didn't recognize, tools that seemed designed for mining but unlike anything he'd seen in the copper operations around Bitter Creek. Maps covered one wall, showing the network of natural caves that honeycombed the cliffs behind the ranch. Red X marks indicated specific locations, and handwritten notes in Pete's cramped writing suggested he'd been tracking something through the underground passages for months before his death. Sarah explained that Pete had been a prospector before, settling at Widow's Peak, but what he'd found in the caves wasn't gold or silver. The mountains held deposits of a strange mineral that glowed with its own inner light, something Pete believed was unlike anything found elsewhere in the territory. He'd extracted small amounts, but the process had begun affecting his health and his mind in ways that frightened even Sarah. The local Apache tribes considered the glowing caves sacred, Sarah continued, warning that disturbing the mineral would bring misfortune to anyone who tried to profit from it. Pete had initially dismissed these warnings as primitive beliefs, but as his health deteriorated and strange accidents began plaguing the ranch, he'd started to believe there might be truth to the ancient stories. Thomas found himself torn between skepticism and growing unease as Sarah recounted Pete's final weeks. The old prospector had become convinced that something was watching him from the caves, following him back to the ranch each night. He'd started leaving offerings of food and tobacco at the cave entrances, hoping to appease whatever presence he'd disturbed with his mining activities. The afternoon sun was high when Sarah offered to show Thomas the caves themselves. They rode horses up a narrow trail that switched back through stands of juniper and pine. climbing steadily toward the massive cliff face that dominated the northern boundary of the ranch. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and Thomas noticed that birds seemed to avoid the higher elevations, leaving an eerie silence broken only by their horses' breathing. The cave entrance was partially concealed by a rockfall that Pete had apparently caused during his final visit to the site. Sarah dismounted and began moving stones with practiced efficiency, revealing an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. She lit a lantern and motioned for Thomas to follow her into the mountain's heart, warning him to stay close and touch nothing without her permission. The cave system exceeded Thomas's wildest imagination, with chambers large enough to hold a church and passages that seemed to extend infinitely into the darkness. But it was the mineral deposits that truly amazed him. Veins of the strange substance ran through the cave walls like frozen lightning, pulsing with a blue-green luminescence that provided enough light to navigate without the lantern. Sarah led him deeper into the caves, past underground streams and formations that sparkled like jewels in the mineral's glow. She explained that Pete had believed the substance might be valuable to Eastern scientists studying electricity and magnetism, but every attempt to transport significant quantities had resulted in disaster. Mules would refuse to carry it, wagons would break down mysteriously, and workers would fall ill with unexplained fevers. In the deepest chamber they visited, Sarah showed Thomas something that made his blood run cold. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, depicting figures that seemed to dance around representations of the glowing mineral, but these weren't typical Native American rock art. The style suggested much greater antiquity, as if they'd been created by people who'd inhabited these mountains long before any known tribes. The petroglyphs told a story, Sarah explained, of beings who'd come from the sky and hidden their treasures in the deep places of the earth. The glowing mineral was meant to remain undisturbed, guarded by those who understood its true nature. Pete had copied many of the symbols, convinced they contained clues to safely extracting and using the mysterious substance. As they prepared to leave the caves, Thomas heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere in the depths came a sound like singing, voices harmonizing in a language he didn't recognize. Sarah grabbed his arm, her face pale in the mineral's glow, and hurried him toward the entrance. She'd heard the voices before, she whispered, always when someone had spent too long in the presence of the glowing veins. The ride back to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Both riders lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced in the caves. Thomas found himself questioning everything he'd believed about the natural world, while Sarah seemed relieved to be away from the mineral's influence. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas realized that his simple real estate acquisition had become something far more complex. That evening, Sarah prepared a dinner that seemed designed to calm frayed nerves. She'd roasted a chicken with herbs that grew wild around the ranch, and the meal was accompanied by bread that tasted like it had been baked by someone who understood the alchemy of flour and fire. As they ate, she told Thomas more about Pete's final days and the strange events that had preceded his death. Pete had started talking to himself, Sarah revealed, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. He'd claimed that the ancient inhabitants of the caves were trying to communicate with him, teaching him the proper rituals for approaching their sacred mineral. The old prospector had begun leaving increasingly elaborate offerings at the cave entrance, including items of personal value that he claimed the spirits had requested. The night Pete died, Sarah had found him in the shed, collapsed over his maps and notes. There were no signs of violence or illness, but his final journal entry spoke of a great revelation about the true purpose of the glowing mineral. He'd written about a responsibility that came with knowledge of the caves, a duty to protect the ancient secret from those who would exploit it. For personal gain, Thomas spent the following days exploring the ranch and trying to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. The property included not just the main house and outbuildings but also mineral rights to thousands of acres of mountain terrain. If the glowing substance truly had scientific value, the potential wealth was staggering. But Sarah's warnings about the fate of previous prospectors gave him pause. He found Pete's journal hidden in a false bottom of the old man's desk, filled with observations about the minerals, properties, and effects on living tissue. The substance seemed to enhance plant growth when used in minute quantities, but larger amounts caused mutations and death. Pete had experimented with exposing various animals to the mineral's radiation, documenting results that ranged from miraculous healing to grotesque deformity. The journal's later entries revealed Pete's growing paranoia about outside interests. Learning of his discovery, he'd received inquiries from mining companies and Eastern investors, people who'd somehow heard rumors about unusual mineral deposits at Widow's Peak Ranch. Pete had refused all offers, convinced that revealing the location would bring disaster, not just to himself but to the entire region. Sarah found Thomas reading the journal by lamplight and sat beside him to share her own memories of Pete's final months. The old prospector had become increasingly protective of her, insisting that she possessed some quality that made her immune to the mineral's harmful effects. He'd begun training her to recognize the signs of mineral poisoning and teaching her the rituals he believed were necessary to safely approach the caves. The more Thomas learned about his inheritance, the more he understood why Pete had been willing to gamble the ranch in a poker game. The old prospector had been looking for someone he could trust with the secret, someone who wouldn't immediately try to exploit the mineral for personal gain. The dollar bet had been symbolic, a way of passing responsibility rather than transferring property. Sarah revealed that she'd been born in the mountains, daughter of a prospector who died in a mining accident when she was young. She'd spent her childhood with the Apache, learning their stories about the sacred caves and the dangers of disturbing the ancient places. When she'd met Pete, something about her background had convinced him that she was meant to be guardian of the mineral deposits. The weight of responsibility began to settle on Thomas's shoulders as he contemplated the implications of his inheritance. He could try to exploit the mineral, risking the disasters that had befallen previous prospectors. He could sell the ranch to mining interests, passing the problem to others while profiting from their eventual misfortune. Or he could accept the role of guardian, protecting the ancient secret while finding a way to honor the trust Pete had placed in him. Days turned into weeks as Thomas wrestled with his decision. Sarah continued to care for the ranch with quiet efficiency, tending a garden that seemed to thrive despite the harsh desert conditions. Thomas began to suspect that she was using small amounts of the mineral to enhance plant growth, but when he questioned her, she simply smiled and suggested that some secrets were better left unspoken. The isolation of Widow's Peak Ranch began to affect Thomas in unexpected ways. Cut off from the familiar rhythms of Eastern civilization, he found himself paying attention to subtle changes in weather patterns and animal behavior that he'd never noticed before. Sarah taught him to read the signs that indicated when conditions were right for visiting the caves safely, knowledge that seemed to come from sources older than written history. One morning, Thomas woke to find fresh horse tracks around the ranch. Buildings, evidence that someone had been watching the property during the night. Sarah examined the tracks with the skill of someone who'd learned tracking from masters, determining that at least 3 riders had circled the ranch before heading back toward Bitter Creek. The implications were troubling, suggesting that word of the ranch's secrets was beginning to spread. Sarah's reaction to the mysterious visitors revealed another aspect of her character that Thomas hadn't previously noticed. She moved through the ranch buildings with practiced efficiency, checking security measures that Pete had apparently established during his final months. Hidden weapons appeared from concealed locations, and Sarah demonstrated familiarity with firearms that suggested extensive training in their use. The afternoon brought unwelcome visitors in the form of 3 men, who introduced themselves as representatives of Eastern mining interests. They'd heard rumors about unusual mineral deposits at Widow's Peak Ranch and were prepared to make generous offers for exploration rights. Thomas recognized the type from his business dealings in Boston. Men who measured success only in terms of profit margins and were willing to destroy anything that stood between them and their objectives. Sarah remained in the background during the meeting, but Thomas noticed how carefully she observed the visitors, memorizing details about their appearance and equipment. When the men finally departed after Thomas politely declined their offers, Sarah revealed that she'd recognized one of them from Pete's descriptions of previous unwelcome visitors. The pressure to reveal the cave's location was escalating, and Thomas realized that neutrality was no longer an option. That evening, Sarah led Thomas to a hidden cache, where Pete had stored evidence of his dealings with various mining interests. Letters and telegrams revealed a pattern of increasing pressure and veiled threats from people who believed the old prospector was hiding valuable mineral deposits. Pete's responses had been consistently evasive, but the correspondence suggested that his death might not have been as natural as it had appeared. The revelation that Pete might have been murdered changed everything for Thomas. What had seemed like a simple inheritance dispute had become a matter of life and death, with forces beyond his understanding competing for control of something they didn't fully comprehend. Sarah's warning about inheriting more than just land had proven prophetic in ways Thomas was only beginning to understand. That as night fell over Widow's Peak Ranch, Thomas found himself standing guard while Sarah performed what she called the evening rituals. These involved placing specific offerings at various locations around the property, actions she claimed were necessary to maintain the balance between the human world and the ancient forces that guarded the mineral deposits. Thomas had initially dismissed these practices as superstition, but recent events had shaken his confidence in rational explanations. The moon rose full and bright over the desert, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Thomas heard the voices from the caves again, carried on the night wind like distant music. Sarah listened with an expression of deep concentration, as if she were receiving important information from the mysterious singers. When the voices finally faded, she turned to Thomas with a look of grave concern. Tomorrow, she announced, they would need to visit the deepest chamber of the cave system, the place Pete had called the heart of the mountain. Something was changing. In the mineral deposits, a shift that required immediate attention from the ranch's guardians. Thomas would need to decide once and for all whether he was prepared to accept the full responsibility of his inheritance, because the ancient forces that protected the caves were losing patience with uncertainty. The night passed slowly. Filled with dreams, Thomas couldn't quite remember. Upon waking, he found himself standing in vast underground chambers, surrounded by beings of light who spoke in languages that bypassed his ears and communicated directly with his soul. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, Thomas felt as if he'd been transformed by experiences that existed somewhere between sleeping and waking. Sarah was already preparing for the journey to the heart of the mountain when Thomas emerged. From the ranch house, he'd gathered supplies that included items Thomas didn't recognize, objects that seemed to pulse with their own inner energy. The ritual preparations were more elaborate than anything she'd done for their previous cave visits, suggesting that they were approaching something of profound significance. The ride to the deepest cave entrance took them through terrain that seemed increasingly otherworldly as they climbed toward the peaks. Plants grew in impossible configurations, and rock formations defied geological explanation. Thomas began to understand that the mineral's influence extended far beyond the underground chambers, affecting the entire ecosystem in ways that science couldn't yet explain. The entrance to the heart of the mountain was concealed behind a waterfall that cascaded from heights lost in morning mist. Sarah dismounted and began an elaborate ritual that involved burning specific herbs and speaking words in what Thomas assumed was Apache language. Only when the ceremony was complete did she lead him through the falling water into a passage that descended steeply into the mountain's core. The heart of the mountain exceeded Thomas's wildest expectations, a chamber so vast that their lamplight couldn't reach the far walls. The mineral deposits here were different from anything they'd seen before, forming crystalline structures that pulsed with rhythmic light like a vast heartbeat. The air itself seemed alive with energy that made Thomas's skin tingle and his thoughts race with possibilities he couldn't quite grasp. In the center of the chamber stood a formation that defied easy description, a pillar of pure mineral that rose from floor to invisible ceiling like a frozen bolt of lightning. Sarah approached the pillar with reverent caution, placing her hands on its surface and closing her eyes in concentration. The mineral's glow intensified in response to her touch, and Thomas heard the voices again, closer and more distinct than ever before. Sarah opened her eyes and turned to Thomas with an expression of profound seriousness. The ancient guardians of the mineral had been waiting for someone to claim full responsibility for the caves and their contents. Pete had been a temporary caretaker, but Thomas's arrival marked the beginning of a new era. The choice he made in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who lived in the shadow of the mountains. The voices in the chamber grew stronger, and Thomas found himself understanding fragments of their message. The mineral was not just a natural resource but a living entity, part of a vast network that connected sacred sites across the continent. Those who accepted guardianship of these places became part of something larger than human civilization, protectors of secrets that predated recorded history. Thomas realized that his journey to Bitter Creek had been orchestrated by forces beyond his comprehension. The poker game, the $1 bet, even his decision to travel west. All had been arranged to bring him to this moment of choice. Sarah had been waiting not just for a new owner of the ranch but for someone who could accept the true responsibility that came with the inheritance. As Thomas placed his hand on the mineral pillar beside Sarah's, the chamber filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voices reached a crescendo of harmony that spoke directly to his soul, welcoming him into an ancient covenant that would forever change his understanding of his place in the world. The transformation was beginning, and there would be no turning back from the path he'd chosen to walk. When the light finally faded and the voices fell silent, Thomas found himself changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Sarah smiled at him with approval and relief, recognizing in his eyes the look of someone who had accepted a sacred trust. Together, they would guard the secrets of Widow's Peak Ranch, protecting the ancient mineral and the forces it represented from those who would exploit it for personal gain. The return journey to the ranch passed in contemplative silence, both riders understanding that they had participated in something that connected them to powers older than human civilization. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Thomas realized that his inheritance had indeed included far more than just land. He had gained a purpose that would define the rest of his life, and a companion who understood the weight of the responsibility they now shared. Years passed at Widow's Peak Ranch, and Thomas learned to read the rhythms of the desert and the mysterious forces that flowed through the mountain caves. Sarah taught him the ancient ways of communicating with the mineral guardians, and together, they developed new methods of protecting the sacred sites from an increasingly industrialized world. The mining companies eventually gave up their pursuit, deterred by a series of unfortunate accidents that befell anyone who pressed too hard for access to the ranch's secrets. Thomas never returned to Boston, finding that his former life held no appeal compared to the profound purpose he'd discovered in the Arizona Territory. He married Sarah in a ceremony that combined Christian traditions with ancient rituals performed in the heart of the mountain, witnessed by forces that had watched over the sacred places since time immemorial. Their children grew up understanding both the beauty and the responsibility of their unique heritage. The ranch prospered in ways that defied conventional explanation, producing crops that thrived in impossible conditions and attracting wildlife that had avoided the area for generations. Visitors to Widow's Peak often commented on the sense of peace and vitality they experienced there, though few suspected the true source of the ranch's remarkable qualities. Thomas and Sarah became respected members of the Bitter Creek community, known for their wisdom and their uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and mineral strikes throughout the region. As Thomas grew older, he often stood on the ranch's front porch in the evening, watching the sun set behind the peaks that held such profound secrets. The voices from the caves still called to him sometimes, reminding him of the covenant he'd made and the trust that had been placed in his hands. He understood now that the $1 he'd wagered in that Boston poker game had purchased far more than property. It had bought him a destiny that connected him to the very soul of the American frontier. The strange mineral remained in its mountain sanctuary, pulsing with ancient rhythms that spoke of civilizations lost to time and powers that transcended human understanding. Thomas had learned that some treasures were meant to be guarded rather than exploited, and that true wealth came not from what could be extracted from the earth but from the wisdom to know what should remain undisturbed. Sarah often reminded him that they were merely the latest in a long line of guardians, caretakers of something sacred that would outlast their own brief lives. The responsibility would pass to their children and their children's children, an unbroken chain of protection that stretched back to the beginning of time and forward to an unknowable future. On quiet desert nights, when the moon cast silver shadows across the ranch and the wind carried whispers from the sacred caves, Thomas would remember the words Sarah had spoken on his first day at Widow's Peak Ranch. He had indeed inherited more than just land. He had gained a connection to the eternal mysteries of the American West, a purpose that transformed a simple real estate transaction into a sacred trust that would define generations yet to come. The glowing heart of the mountain continued to beat with its ancient rhythm, protected by those who understood that some secrets were worth more than gold, and that the greatest inheritance of all was the wisdom to know when not to claim what seemed rightfully yours. In the end, Thomas McKenna had discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought with money, but could only be earned through the courage to accept responsibility for something greater than oneself. The decades that followed brought changes to the Arizona Territory that Thomas could never have imagined when he first stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Bitter Creek. The railroad arrived, bringing with it prospectors, settlers, and entrepreneurs, who transformed the sleepy frontier town into a bustling hub of commerce and industry. Yet Widow's Peak Ranch remained untouched by the relentless march of progress. Protected by forces that subtly discouraged unwanted visitors and deflected the attention of those who might exploit its secrets, Thomas watched his children grow into adulthood with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling. His eldest son, Jacob, showed the same sensitivity to the mountain's ancient rhythms that had marked Sarah as special from the beginning. The boy could sense changes in the mineral's energy days before they became apparent to his parents, and he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the rituals necessary to maintain harmony between the human and spiritual realms. Their daughter, Alina, inherited her mother's gift for communication with the unseen guardians of the caves. She would spend hours in the garden, tending plants that seemed to respond to her touch with supernatural vitality. Thomas often found her sitting quietly by the creek that ran behind the house, apparently listening to voices that only she could hear. When he asked about these conversations, Alina would smile with the wisdom of someone far older than her years and explain that the mountain was teaching her songs that had been sung since before the first humans walked the desert. As the new century approached, bringing with it technologies that would have seemed like magic to the pioneers who first settled the territory, Thomas began to understand the true scope of the network Sarah had told him about during their first visit to the heart of the mountain. Letters arrived from guardians of other sacred sites across the continent, people who had accepted similar responsibilities and who shared information about the changing energies that flowed through the ancient places. The mineral deposits at Widow's Peak were apparently connected to sites as distant as the Black Hills of South Dakota and the copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Each location held its own unique properties, but all were part of a vast grid of power that indigenous peoples had recognized and protected for countless generations. Thomas had become part of something that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, a community of guardians united by their commitment to preserving mysteries that science was not yet ready to understand. Sarah's health began to decline as she entered her 70s, though she remained remarkably vital for someone who had lived such a demanding life. Thomas suspected that her long exposure to the beneficial aspects of the mineral had slowed her aging process. but even ancient power couldn't halt the natural cycle of life and death. She spent her final years training Alina in the more complex aspects of guardianship, passing on knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of careful observation and spiritual communion. The night Sarah died, the entire ranch was bathed in a soft, blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. Thomas stood vigil beside her bed as she drew her final breaths, and in that moment of transition, he felt the presence of all the guardians who had come before them. Sarah's spirit seemed to join that eternal company, taking her place among the protectors who watched over the sacred places from realms beyond human perception. Thomas lived for another decade after Sarah's passing, long enough to see Jacob assume full responsibility for the ranch and to watch Alina marry a young Apache man who understood the old ways and respected the traditions that governed life at Widow's Peak. The continuity of guardianship was assured, and Thomas felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that a sacred trust would be preserved for future generations. On his final visit to the heart of the mountain, Thomas made the journey alone, his aged body moving slowly but surely along paths he had walked countless times over the years. The mineral pillar pulsed with welcoming energy as he placed his hands on its surface one last time, and the voices of the ancient guardians sang him a song of gratitude that echoed through the vast chamber like a choir of angels. Thomas McKenna died peacefully in his sleep on a warm spring night, surrounded by the family he had raised and the land he had learned to love more than life itself. His final words, spoken to Jacob as the sun set behind the familiar peaks, were a reminder that the greatest treasures in life were those that couldn't be measured in dollars or weighed in scales. The inheritance he left to his children was far more valuable than gold or silver. It was the knowledge that they were part of something eternal and the responsibility to protect mysteries that connected the material world to realms of infinite possibility. The ranch continued to thrive under Jacob's stewardship, and the sacred caves remained protected by those who understood their true value. Visitors to the area sometimes reported strange lights in the mountains and voices carried on the desert wind, but these phenomena were dismissed by rational minds as natural curiosities or folklore embellishments. The guardians of Widow's Peak Ranch smiled at such explanations, knowing that the greatest secrets were hidden in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that most people were too busy looking for obvious treasures to notice the miracles that surrounded them every day.